In October 2000, the quiet suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, became the setting for one of the most shocking domestic murder cases in the state's history. Joseph Andriano, a 33-year-old father and devoted husband battling a rare form of cancer, was fighting for his life when he placed his trust in the one person who was supposed to protect him, his wife, Wendi. He didn't know it would be the last night he would ever see. What happened inside their apartment was brutal and heartbreaking. Joe was first poisoned with a lethal chemical, then beaten with a bar stool more than 20 times, and finally had his throat slashed. The attack was so vicious, so calculated, that investigators later described it as especially cruel. But perhaps the most disturbing part was who committed it: the woman he had married, the mother of his children. Prosecutors said Wendi Andriano was motivated by money and freedom, pointing to her attempts to secure life insurance policies and her extramarital affairs. The jury agreed, and in 2004 she was sentenced to death, making her one of the very few women on Arizona's death row. More than 2 decades later, Wendi remains behind bars in the Perryville prison complex, with no execution date set. She has never had a last meal, never spoken final words. Instead, she continues to fight her sentence through appeals, waiting in a cell that may one day lead her to the death chamber. To understand how a wife's betrayal turned into one of Arizona's most chilling murder cases, and why this story continues to haunt the courts, the families, and the public, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a case that doesn't just shock a family, it unsettles an entire state. Joseph "Joe" Andriano was known to those around him as a kind-hearted, gentle soul, a man who worked hard, loved his family deeply, and was respected in his community. Born in 1967, Joe grew up with strong values and a quiet determination that carried into his adult life. He met Wendi when they were both young, and together they built what seemed, at least from the outside, like a promising future. They married, had 2 children, and like many couples, dreamed of building a life rooted in love, stability, and family. But everything changed in 1998 when Joe received a devastating diagnosis: adenoid cystic carcinoma, a rare and relentless form of cancer that slowly began to erode his health. The news was crushing, not just for him, but for the entire family. Joe faced chemotherapy and treatments that left him weakened and drained. But through it all, he showed remarkable courage, never wanting his illness to define him or darken the lives of his wife and children. Friends and family remembered Joe as someone who, even in the midst of pain, tried to smile, tried to be present, and tried to make life as normal as possible for his kids. He fought through exhaustion, endured the sickness that came with his treatments, and carried the weight of his illness quietly, always trying to shield his loved ones from the worst of it. As the cancer advanced, his body grew frail. Tasks that once came easily became impossible, leaving him increasingly vulnerable and dependent on Wendi, the woman he trusted most, for care. What no one could imagine was that the very person entrusted with protecting him, in his weakest and most fragile moments, would soon become the person to betray him in the most unthinkable way. Wendi Elizabeth Ochoa, later known as Wendi Andriano, was born in 1970 in Indiana before her family eventually moved to Arizona, where she grew up in the sprawling suburbs of Phoenix, a world away from the small Midwestern town of her birth. And from the outside, Wendi's life appeared ordinary, even enviable. She was bright, social, and ambitious, a young woman who seemed to want all the trappings of stability and success. And when she married Joseph "Joe" Andriano at a young age, the couple quickly began building a family, welcoming 2 children into their lives, presenting to the community the image of a happy, hard-working, suburban household. But beneath that picture of domestic normalcy, tensions were quietly building, and Wendi, who some described as restless and unfulfilled, began showing signs of dissatisfaction with her marriage and her circumstances. As Joe's health began to falter with a devastating cancer diagnosis, the dynamic of their relationship shifted dramatically. Wendi, once a partner in building a life together, suddenly found herself thrust into the role of primary caregiver, managing not only the household and their children, but also the day-to-day realities of Joe's weakening condition. Financial pressures mounted, medical bills piled up, and the weight of responsibility seemed to grow heavier with each passing month, leaving Wendi feeling trapped in a life far removed from the one she had envisioned for herself. It was during this period that she began engaging in extramarital affairs, seeking, according to prosecutors, not just escape but validation, a way to reclaim some sense of excitement and control over her life, even as her husband lay dying. These relationships painted a stark contrast to the image of a devoted wife and mother that she maintained publicly, and prosecutors later argued they were a window into her state of mind, a woman increasingly disillusioned with her marriage and her future. On top of that, the family's financial struggles deepened, and investigators would later uncover that Wendi had looked into life insurance policies on Joe and had even considered the potential financial windfall from a pending medical malpractice lawsuit against his doctors. To the prosecution, this painted a clear picture of motive. Wendi was a woman desperate to free herself from the burdens of caregiving, the suffocating financial debt, and a marriage she no longer wanted, and they argued that she saw Joe's illness not just as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to cash in and move on with her life. In court, this narrative became the foundation of the state's case, portraying Wendi as someone who, behind closed doors, was not the struggling wife fighting alongside her husband, but rather a woman plotting a way out, even if that way meant betrayal in its darkest form. On the night of October 8, 2000, inside a modest Phoenix apartment, Joseph Joe Andriano lay weakened by months of cancer and the harsh toll of chemotherapy. His once strong frame reduced to frailty, his body exhausted by the illness that had consumed his life, and as he sat vulnerable in his own home, trusting his wife to care for him, Wendi allegedly put into motion a plan that investigators would later describe as both deliberate and merciless. According to prosecutors, she first turned to poison, administering sodium azide, a toxic chemical compound that she had secretly obtained under a false name, a substance powerful enough to kill, but slow enough to prolong his suffering. But when the poison did not work quickly enough to bring about his death, she escalated the violence in a way that stunned even seasoned detectives. Grabbing a bar stool, she struck Joe repeatedly, delivering at least 23 blows to his head and body, the force of which fractured bone and left devastating injuries, before finally taking a knife and slashing his throat, an act that ended his life in a scene of unimaginable brutality. In the chaos that followed, around 1 o'clock in the morning, when he dialed 911, telling paramedics that Joe was gravely ill and had a do not resuscitate order, insisting that it was his wish not to receive medical intervention. And when emergency crews arrived, she convinced them to leave, claiming there was nothing they could do, sending them away from a man who was in desperate need of help. Nearly an hour later, she called again, this time with a very different story, telling authorities that Joe had become violent, that he had attacked her, and that she had been forced to stab and beat him in self-defense. But forensic evidence told a far darker truth. Joe's body, already ravaged by cancer and chemotherapy, and further weakened by the poison coursing through his system, showed that he was physically incapable of mounting any kind of assault. Investigators concluded that in his final hours, Joe Andriano had been not the aggressor, but the victim of a carefully planned and cold-blooded killing at the hands of the very person he had trusted most. When police began piecing together the events of that October night, it quickly became clear that Wendi Andriano's story did not align with the evidence left behind in the apartment. The inconsistencies were glaring, and investigators grew more suspicious with every detail uncovered. The 911 calls painted a narrative of a wife overwhelmed and acting in self-defense, but the physical evidence told a very different story. At the autopsy, doctors discovered not only the devastating blunt force trauma from at least 23 crushing blows to Joe's head and body, but also the unmistakable presence of sodium azide in his system, confirming that he had been poisoned before the brutal assault, a revelation that turned the case from one of possible domestic dispute into a clear picture of premeditated murder. Detectives digging into Wendi's background uncovered a trail of troubling evidence. She had researched deadly poisons, gone out of her way to obtain sodium azide under a false identity, and, perhaps most damning, had attempted to purchase life insurance policies on her terminally ill husband, raising immediate red flags about financial motive. The deeper investigators looked, the more unsettling the portrait of Wendi became. Witnesses came forward to testify that she had been carrying on extramarital affairs, further reinforcing the prosecution's claim that she was a wife eager to shed the burdens of a sick husband, financial hardship, and family responsibility in exchange for freedom and opportunity. Each piece of evidence layered upon the next, forming a picture of calculation rather than desperation, of intent rather than impulse. By the time detectives completed their investigation, the conclusion was undeniable. Joe Andriano had not died in a moment of passion or defense, but in a carefully orchestrated act of betrayal and violence. Armed with forensic proof, witness testimony, and a compelling narrative of motive, authorities moved swiftly. Wendi Andriano was formally arrested and charged with first-degree murder, beginning a legal battle that would soon grip Arizona, and placing her on a path that led not only into the courtroom, but eventually to the most severe penalty the state could deliver, a sentence of death. The trial of Wendi Elizabeth Andriano began on August 23, 2004, and from the very start, it was clear that this would not be a simple case of a grieving wife caught in tragic circumstances, but rather a battle over whether her actions represented desperation or cold-blooded calculation. The prosecution meticulously laid out a chilling narrative of premeditated murder, presenting the jury with evidence that Wendi had gone to great lengths to secure a toxic chemical, sodium azide, under false pretenses, evidence that Joe had not only been poisoned but also bludgeoned with staggering force and fatally slashed in the throat, and evidence of her extramarital affairs and failed attempts to secure life insurance policies on her dying husband, all of which painted her as a woman motivated not by fear or survival, but by greed, freedom, and the desire to escape the burden of a terminally ill spouse. The defense, however, tried to reframe Wendi's actions in a very different light, arguing that she had long been a victim of a volatile and abusive marriage, that Joe, despite his weakened state, could still pose a threat, and that her actions on the night of October 8, 2000, were the frantic, misguided decisions of a battered wife acting in self-defense rather than a calculated killer executing a plan. They attempted to humanize her as a mother of two under immense stress, a woman overwhelmed by financial pressure and emotional strain. But the cold facts presented by forensic experts and the disturbing brutality of the attack undercut those claims. Over the weeks that followed, the jurors listened to testimony from medical examiners, law enforcement officers, and even Wendi's acquaintances who spoke of her affairs and apparent restlessness with her life, each detail reinforcing the prosecution's theory of motive and intent. The evidence became too overwhelming to ignore, and when the time came to deliberate, the jury decisively rejected the defense's argument of self-defense. On November 18, 2004, Wendi Andriano was convicted of first-degree murder, a verdict that sealed her fate and brought a measure of closure to those who had watched Joe suffer not only from illness, but from a violent and unnecessary end. Just over a month later, during the sentencing phase, the gravity of her crime and the aggravating factors weighed heavily on the court. On December 22, 2004, Wendi Andriano was formally sentenced to death by lethal injection, making her one of the very few women on Arizona's death row and forever etching her name into the annals of the state's most shocking and brutal murder cases. Following her conviction and death sentence, Wendi Andriano's case automatically advanced to the appeals stage, as is required in capital punishment cases, and in 2007 the Arizona Supreme Court carefully reviewed her trial record, with her defense team arguing that the introduction of evidence about her extramarital affairs and her failed attempts to secure life insurance policies on Joe had unfairly prejudiced the jury against her, and further insisting that jurors should have been given the option of considering lesser charges, such as second-degree murder or manslaughter, rather than being confined to an all-or-nothing decision between first-degree murder and acquittal. The state, however, countered that the evidence was directly relevant to establishing motive and intent, and after weighing the arguments, the High Court issued a firm ruling. The conviction and sentence would stand, leaving Wendi's hopes of overturning her fate shattered. In the years that followed, Wendi pursued additional avenues of relief through post-conviction petitions and federal habeas filings. But each effort met the same result: rejection, with courts consistently finding no grounds to disturb the jury's decision or the trial court sentence. Today, she remains confined to the Lumley Unit at Perryville Prison, Arizona's maximum security facility for women, and she is one of only a handful of women on the state's death row, a population so small it stands in stark contrast to the hundreds of men awaiting execution. Life behind those walls is rigid and isolating. Inmates spend the majority of their days inside small cells, allowed limited time for exercise or visitation, always under heavy surveillance. And for death row prisoners like Wendi, the looming reality of an eventual execution adds an unshakable weight to the monotony of prison life. Her days are marked by strict schedules, early morning head counts, restricted movement, meals served through slots in the door, and occasional time in a caged yard for recreation. A far cry from the suburban life she once lived as a wife and mother. For Wendi Andriano, the appeals process has offered only fleeting hope, and with every petition denied, the reality of her sentence remains unchanged. She is a condemned woman, her story frozen in time as she continues to wait in the shadows of Perryville's death row, her fate sealed but not yet carried out. Awaiting execution. Unlike many capital defendants whose journeys end with a date on the execution calendar, Wendi Andriano remains in a state of limbo, her case tied up in the lengthy and often unpredictable legal process that defines death row in America. More than 2 decades have passed since the night Joe Andriano lost his life. Yet Wendi has not been given an execution warrant, meaning that unlike other notorious inmates, she has never reached the point of being offered a final meal or asked to speak her last words in the death chamber. Instead, her days are marked by waiting, by appeals filed and denied, by the passing of years behind Perryville's concrete walls, and by the uncertainty of whether Arizona will ever move forward with carrying out her sentence, or if she will live out her remaining years confined within those same gray corridors. Her case stands as a reminder that the death penalty is not only about executions, but also about the long shadow of waiting, where justice, punishment, and closure all hang suspended in time. For now, Wendi Andriano's story does not end with a gurney, a syringe, or final words echoing across a chamber, but with the silence of a woman still awaiting execution, her fate resting not in her hands, but in the hands of the courts and the state, caught between the possibility of scheduled death and the slow inevitability of growing old behind bars. At the very center of this heartbreaking story is Joseph Joe Andriano, a kind-hearted man and devoted father who is battling cancer with quiet courage, betrayed in the most vulnerable hours of his life by the very person he trusted above all others, his wife. The murder of Joe Andriano remains one of Arizona's most chilling and deeply unsettling examples of marital betrayal and domestic brutality, not only because of the violence inflicted on a terminally ill man, but also because of the devastating aftermath it left behind. In a single night, 2 young children lost the guiding presence of their father and, through the justice system's response, lost their mother as well, left to grow up with a haunting truth that their family was torn apart from within. Nearly 25 years later, Wendi Andriano's story still has no final chapter. She sits on Arizona's death row, condemned but not yet executed, her fate suspended in the long corridors of legal appeals and procedural delays. The question lingers heavily in the air. Will the state of Arizona one day carry out her sentence? Or will she spend the remainder of her life behind bars, aging within the walls of Perryville, waiting for an end that may never come? What do you think? Should Wendi Andriano's death sentence be carried out, or should she spend the rest of her life behind bars? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell so you never miss our deep dive true crime documentaries.